The brush stopped moving. The archaeologist crouching in the dim light of the excavation trench did not stand up immediately. She did not call out to her colleagues. She just stayed there, kneeling in the Cretan dust, looking at the clay surface that had just emerged from beneath 3,500 years of soil. And what she saw carved into it were signs, dozens of them, rows upon rows of clean, deliberate incisions pressed into fired clay. Signs that nobody alive on earth can read. This is the story of what a room full of those signs means. Why it matters. Why it has resisted every brilliant mind that has ever tried to crack it. And why a sealed chamber might be the closest thing we have ever had to a real shot at hearing the voice of Europe's first great civilization. To understand why a sealed chamber full of clay tablets sends a particular kind of electricity through the archaeological world, you first have to understand who left them there. Long before Athens rose. Long before the Parthenon sat on its hill. Long before the idea of Greece had any shape at all, there was Crete. And on Crete, there was a people we now call the Minoans, a name borrowed from the mythological king Minos, whom ancient Greek legend seated on a throne at Knossos. The Minoans flourished across the Bronze Age, roughly from 3000 BCE through to approximately 1450 BCE, and what they built was extraordinary by any honest reckoning. At Knossos, at Phaistos, at Malea, at Zakros, they constructed massive palace complexes that rose across multiple stories, riddled with hundreds of rooms, staircases, storage magazines, and engineered light wells designed to pull sunlight deep into interior spaces. Later Greek legend may well have remembered the labyrinthine complexity of Knossos as the inspiration for the actual labyrinth, the impossible maze built to contain the Minotaur. The Minoans ran engineered drainage systems and plumbing at a scale that Europe would not match again for centuries. They painted murals of extraordinary life and movement, dolphins arcing through blue water, athletes vaulting over charging bulls, processions of figures in vivid ceremonial dress. Their art still feels modern when you stand in front of it. They were also a sea power of formidable reach. The fingerprints of Minoan trade and influence appear across the Bronze Age Mediterranean, with linear A inscriptions turning up not only across Crete but at sites connected as far afield as the Cyclades, Rhodes, and the wider Aegean world. This was a wealthy, literate, organized civilization. When it wrote something down, it was not idle record-keeping. It was the administrative machinery of a sophisticated state tracking everything it controlled. And every single word of it remains locked away from us. Picture what it means when archaeologists unseal a chamber in a Minoan building and find it full of clay tablets. The Minoans built their palace complexes around exactly this kind of space. They maintained dedicated administrative rooms. They lined storerooms with great pottery vessels. And in the destruction layers of those buildings, in rooms left sealed by catastrophe, archaeologists have on several occasions found concentrated deposits of linear A tablets and clay ceilings sitting precisely where the Minoan scribes left them, sometimes still resting inside the same containers that originally held them. The most significant of these discoveries came from Hagia Triada, a site in southern Crete located just a few kilometers from the great palace of Phaistos. The linear A archive recovered from Hagia Triada is by a wide margin the largest single concentration of linear A documents ever found anywhere. It comprised 147 clay tablets, 22 roundels, 53 noduli, 76 flat-based nodules, 11 two-hole hanging nodules, and a remarkable 936 inscribed single-hole hanging nodules, a total of more than 1,000 sealed documents of various types, all dating to the late Minoan IB period before the site was destroyed by fire. The archive was distributed between two buildings on the site, administrative material concentrated in the royal villa, and the bulk of the tablets in a second building the Italian excavators called the Casa del Labite. At Zakros on the far eastern coast of Crete, archaeologists found a dedicated archive room inside the palace itself, its tablets still in context. At Knossos, at Phaistos, at Chania, more tablets and clay ceilings emerged from administrative contexts. Wherever Minoan power concentrated, records followed. Where records existed, there was a room to hold them. And here is the detail that explains why any of these documents survive at all. Clay tablets do not last 3.5 millennia on their own. Raw clay crumbles back to mud. The reason we have even a single linear A tablet in our hands comes down to an accident of catastrophe. When these Minoan buildings burned, and burn they did, violently and suddenly around 1450 BCE, the heat from those fires baked the soft clay tablets as hard as kiln-fired pottery. Documents the Minoans never intended to be permanent, working records meant to be wiped and reused, became accidentally immortal precisely because the world around them ended in fire. The Minoans did not preserve these tablets for us. Destruction preserved them. And if that much survived by accident, in rooms that nobody built to be permanent archives, the question becomes almost unbearable: what might still be waiting in the rooms we have not yet opened? The signs on those tablets are called Linear A. The name was given to them by Sir Arthur Evans, the British archaeologist who pulled the first examples out of the ground at Knossos around the year 1900. He called it linear because the signs are formed from simple lines pressed or incised into clay, distinguishing it from the more pictorial Cretan hieroglyphic script that was also in use on the island and also remains undeciphered. Evans named the script. He catalogued it. He recognized it as something distinct. And then he, and every scholar who came after him for more than a century, ran into walls. There are 3 walls, and together they explain everything. The first is scale. The entire surviving corpus of Linear A comprises approximately 1,500 inscriptions containing roughly 7,400 individual signs. That sounds significant until you understand that deciphering a writing system through pattern analysis alone requires volume, a great deal of volume. You need enough repeated signs in enough varied contexts to start isolating grammar, to separate verbs from nouns, to distinguish personal names from commodity labels. Linear A does not give you that volume. It gives you fragments. The second wall is the condition of those fragments. These are not clean, complete texts. They are short. Many are broken. A significant proportion are formulaic, the same administrative entries, the same ritual phrases recurring across sites with only minor variations. Very few inscriptions run to more than a handful of words. You are not reading a library. You are reading scraps rescued from a filing system that someone destroyed. The third wall is the deepest one, and it is the wall that ends the conversation. Nobody knows what language Linear A records. The language behind Linear A, called Minoan for lack of any better name, does not appear to be Indo-European. It does not appear to be Semitic. Despite decades of attempts to connect it with Luwian, Hittite, languages of the Black Sea region, and various other candidates, no convincing linguistic relationship has ever been established. Minoan appears to be what linguists call a language isolate, a language that died so completely it left no descendants, no relatives, and no living traces anywhere on Earth. What that means in practice is this. Even if every sign of Linear A were assigned its correct sound value tomorrow, researchers would still be pronouncing a language nobody understands. The sounds would be right. The meaning would remain sealed. No amount of phonetic reconstruction helps you read a language when the language itself has vanished from the planet entirely. The one thing that could cut through all 3 walls at once has never appeared. There is no Rosetta Stone for Linear A. No bilingual inscription exists where the same Minoan text sits alongside a version in a language we already read. That single object, a text translated by its own creators into something accessible, is what cracked Egyptian hieroglyphs. For Linear A, it has simply never been found. Here is the cruelest detail in the whole story. We have already deciphered the successor script. Out of Linear A, a later writing system grew. Scholars call it Linear B. It came into use from around 1450 BCE, as the Mycenaeans, Greek-speaking people from the mainland, gained control over parts of Crete and adapted the existing Minoan script for their own administrative purposes. Linear B looks visibly related to Linear A. Many signs are shared between them or clearly derived from one another. Set a tablet from each script side by side and the family resemblance is obvious. In 1952, a young English architect named Michael Ventris, working from foundations laid by the American classicist Alice Kober, who had spent years isolating repeating patterns in the signs before her death in 1950, cracked Linear B completely. Ventris built an enormous systematic grid of phonetic relationships based on sign frequency and positioning. In 1952, he tested a hypothesis that certain clusters of signs recurring frequently on tablets from Knossos were the names of Cretan towns. He slotted in the sound values that would make those clusters read as Knossos, Amnisos, Tylissos. The system clicked open. Sign by sign, word by word, the tablets began to yield their contents. On the 1st of July, 1952, Ventris announced his findings on BBC Radio. The language hidden inside Linear B was Greek, an archaic, early form of Greek predating Homer by centuries, but unmistakably Greek. It remains to this day the only Bronze Age Aegean script that has ever been fully read. And what did those Linear B tablets contain? Inventories. The movement of livestock, grain, bronze, and people through the palace systems of Mycenaean Greece. Administrative records. Accounting. The day-to-day bureaucratic operation of a palace economy. Now hold both facts together. We can read Linear B in its entirety. Linear B developed directly out of Linear A, borrowing its signs and its format and its administrative logic. The descendant has been fully understood for over 70 years. And the parent, the script from which all of it grew, has not yielded a single word of confirmed meaning. We can read the daughter. We cannot read the mother. When archaeologists open a sealed chamber and find Linear A tablets inside, the most honest answer to the question of what is written there is not the most romantic one. But it is still extraordinary. Based on everything scholars can partially read, the numeral systems, the ideographic signs for commodities like grain, olive oil, wine, and livestock, the structural patterns of the inscriptions, the strong probability is that most Linear A tablets contain administrative records. Inventories. Ration allocations. Commodity tracking. Lists of personnel. The records of an economic machine running at full operation. The Hagia Triada archive, even only partially understood, appears to deal with agricultural goods, grain, figs, wine, with livestock counts, with what scholars interpret as ration distributions to workers, with the broader economic organization of a Minoan administrative center. One carefully studied tablet from that archive carries multiple separate lists arranged under headings, with columns of symbols, numerals, and fractional signs. And at the bottom of those columns sits a recurring Minoan word that researchers believe means total, not because they translated it, but because it appears in the precise position where a sum always goes, doing the only job a sum can do. That detail is the entire situation in miniature. We can locate the Minoan word for total by watching where it sits in the accounting structure. We cannot read a single other word on the same tablet. Linear A also appears on ritual objects and stone offering tables found in sanctuary contexts, which suggests the script was used not only for economic administration but also for recording dedications and offerings in religious settings. The discovery in 2024 at Knossos of an ivory scepter bearing what researchers identified as the longest single Linear A inscription yet found reinforced this dual function. The main body of the inscription appeared to be a ceremonial or ritual text with no numerals, while the handle carried an inscription structured more like an administrative record, complete with numerical and fractional signs. A fully sealed, internally connected archive of such documents would not give us Minoan literature. It would give us the live financial and sacred memory of a Minoan administrative center, tax records, trade manifests, ration lists, commodity inventories, religious offerings logged to gods whose names we may never be able to pronounce correctly. Accounting is where a civilization stops performing for posterity and tells the unguarded truth about its daily operations. Who worked? Who was fed? What was counted? What was sacrificed? A complete connected archive would hand us the live machinery of Europe's first great civilization, in its own words, on the day everything stopped. The reason a sealed chamber matters so much more than another handful of scattered fragments comes down to one word that researchers in this field use more than almost any other: context. Linear A has resisted decipherment for over a century not simply because so little of it exists, but because what exists is isolated. A short list from one site. A broken tablet from another. A ritual phrase repeated on unrelated objects found decades and hundreds of kilometers apart. It is like trying to reconstruct a language from a shoebox full of torn receipts and a few engraved ceremonial spoons. You can study that shoebox for a lifetime, and it will never yield a sentence. What scholars have never possessed is a large, internally connected body of text from a single place, documents written by the same scribes, recording related transactions, where one tablet refers to another, where the same names recur across many documents, where the same commodities are tracked through a chain of entries. Documents that talk to each other. An archive in which you can watch a whole administrative system operating, rather than examining frozen individual scraps. That is exactly what a sealed, intact deposit could provide. Not simply more signs, signs in relationship. Signs that illuminate one another. Repeated personal names that can be separated from titles. Grammatical patterns that emerge through repetition. The shapes of verbs distinguished from the shapes of nouns. Decipherment does not come from accumulating more lonely words. It comes from catching a language in the act of being a system. A sealed chamber, undisturbed, internally coherent, is the closest realistic approximation anyone could hope for. The scholars working on Linear A today do not work the way Ventris did, hunched over hand-drawn grids of photographed tablets. They have tools he could not have imagined. Researchers including Esther Salgarella have built digital databases, most notably Sigla, the Signs of Linear A project, that for the first time place the inscriptions in an open, interactive digital space where every individual sign can be searched, compared, and analyzed computationally. Hundreds of standardized signs from hundreds of inscriptions, thousands of individual sign instances accessible simultaneously to anyone working in the field, rather than locked in the heads of a handful of specialists. Computational and artificial intelligence approaches have joined the effort since approximately 2019. Researchers at Cambridge, the University of Melbourne, and other institutions have applied deep neural network models, minimum cost flow graph optimization frameworks, and brute force computational analysis to the Linear A corpus. A 2024 study combining two distinct computational decipherment approaches, one assigning phonetic values by analogy with Linear B, another assessing structural connections with other Mediterranean scripts, attempted to shed new light on the possible language relationships of Minoan. The results were illuminating about the methodology without cracking the fundamental problem. What computational tools can do that no single human mind can match is compare thousands of sign variants, hunt for repetitions invisible to manual study, and flag structural patterns buried within the full corpus simultaneously. Every specialist who has worked with these tools agrees, however, on a single point. No algorithm will wake up one morning and translate Minoan. The fundamental walls have not moved. The corpus is still too small. There is still no bilingual key. The language still has no known relatives. What has changed is the ceiling of what analysis can achieve. The tools can now see the whole of Linear A at once and search it for hidden order at a scale that was impossible for any previous generation of scholars. Put those tools together with a sealed archive that could pour new, contextually connected material into the gap they are currently starving for, and the situation changes in a way it has not changed for a very long time. There is a shadow over all of this that no discovery and no algorithm can fully lift. Around 1450 BCE, the Minoan world came apart. Across Crete, the major palace centers were destroyed or abandoned in a relatively short and violent period. The causes are still debated: volcanic disruption from the Thera eruption, earthquakes, internal collapse, the expansion of Mycenaean Greek power from the mainland, or some combination of these forces arriving in quick succession. Whatever the precise sequence, the result was the same. The centers of Minoan civilization that had stood for centuries went dark. And Linear A went dark with them. In many of the same buildings, on many of the same clay tablets, the Mycenaeans who took administrative control introduced Linear B, the script that recorded Greek. The daughter moved into the house of the mother. The same kind of clay. The same administrative format. A different people. A different tongue. And the Minoans who could read Linear A, not slowly, not with effort, not by working through grammar tables, but instantly and fluently, the way you are processing these words right now, simply ceased to exist. There was no gradual handover. No Minoan scribe sat down to compose a translation as a gift to the future. No bridge text was deliberately left behind. The people who held the meaning of every sign on every tablet walked into history and did not come back. And the meaning went with them, sealed inside fired clay that has now outlasted them by 35 centuries. We hold in our hands the records of a civilization written in that civilization's own words. We can touch the clay. We can trace the signs with our fingers. We can reproduce the shapes with perfect accuracy. We cannot hear a single word of what they say. Not because the records were lost. Because the only minds that ever understood them turned to dust before anyone thought to ask what they meant. So here is the honest position. A sealed chamber full of Linear A inscriptions would not be translated on the day it was opened. Nobody walks out of that excavation reading Minoan. The walls are still standing. The corpus is still small. The language is still an isolate with no living relatives. A new room full of tablets changes none of that in an afternoon. But here is what would change, and it is not a small thing. A genuinely intact, connected Minoan archive would be the single most significant addition to this field in generations. It would add volume where volume is the bottleneck. It would add context where context is the missing ingredient. It would deposit new material into the field at precisely the moment when digital tools and computational analysis are finally capable of doing something with it that no previous era could manage. It would not be the answer on its own. It would be the most credible pathway toward an answer that anyone has stood at in more than 100 years. And underneath the script, underneath the administrative lists and the commodity tallies and the offering records, there is something else. These marks on clay are the surviving voice of Europe's first great civilization. The people who pressed those signs into wet clay were tracking the grain their workers needed to live, the wine allocated for a ceremony, the livestock counted at the end of a season, the offerings carried to gods in hilltop sanctuaries above the sea. They were doing what all literate peoples do, making the world around them legible, controllable, recordable. And then they were gone. Somewhere in those unreadable signs is the everyday truth of a world that built palaces and painted dolphins and sailed the Bronze Age Mediterranean and then disappeared so completely it took its own language with it. The signs are still there. The clay is still there. Fired hard by the same disaster that ended everything around it, waiting in the dark under Cretan soil, perfectly preserved, silent only because the last person who understood them died 35 centuries ago. The sealed chamber did not open and immediately answer a century of questions. But discoveries exactly like this one are the only way those questions ever get answered at all.